you, Andrew Pragnell, very much once again for joining us on this series called Ask a CEO. You are an impressive CEO by your background, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit more detail. But I guess I just thought it'd be cool just to kind of recap how the two of us got connected. And I think that really sets the scene for the topic of today's discussion. What we're trying to do also at Fully Boss in this interview series is really delving into a topic that is relevant to a particular executive, such as yourself, and also has some, I guess, relationship to what we're doing at Fully Boss, which, as you know, is all around helping people advance careers using soft skills. And when you and I had met, you talked about some really interesting stories and some really interesting perspectives around mindset and around resilience. And as an executive, as a really senior executive, as a CEO, and you'll talk a bit more about your role, I thought it was really a great invitation for the audience listening as you were speaking to get a real insight into the fact that it's not always rosy at the top. And I really appreciated you sharing your story. So I guess that's just a little tease for the audience in terms of what we're going to get into in today's discussion. But it's going to be everything around kind of mindset, resilience, and really some of the I guess, the key challenges that you might go through in one's career trying to get to that position, and also once you're at the position, but also giving our audience a bit of flavour and a few insights in terms of how you can overcome certain challenges. Why don't you just give the audience, give us a flavour of who you are? So I'd love to just go back a little bit in terms of your personal background, and then also the role that you have today.
Sure thing. Yeah, and thanks a lot for having me on the show, Ollie. Great to be here. So when you ask me to go right back, I often think of genealogy, and some of us, think a long way back when we are asked to go back, I guess. But very briefly, I'm from a small island off the coast of New Zealand, a little island called Waiheke, where I was raised by my mother, a solo mother and an only child, in fairly modest circumstances, and grew up for the most part and attended university in New Zealand. I spent about 10 years representing New Zealand in judo, the martial art, which probably has led to influencing my mindset and my philosophy and the way I guess I approach a lot of things in life. I've had a really long history in sport management and also working in the human rights sector and also in development in the Pacific. So working in development aid, working for not-for-profits. And it was only natural as my two passions came together, which was both trying to generate societal change and impact on human development and my love of sport, that I would find myself in arguably, definitely the biggest sport in the world, but now as the Chief Executive Officer of New Zealand Football, the national body charged with leading the development and growth of the sport in New Zealand, and obviously representing ourselves on the global stage, running all of our international teams, of which we'll be obviously hosting the Women's World Cup next year, which is enormous, running all our domestic competitions and managing the game in New Zealand. So it's a big responsibility. When everyone thinks of New Zealand, they often think of rugby. Some time ago, though, actually, football overtook rugby as the biggest participation sport in New Zealand, and I think I see a time in our trajectory where we are recognised globally for our football. Obviously, rugby is a sport that the country is well known for, but we're in the right direction.
Amazing. Sounds like you are a very busy man. I mean, I kind of know you are based on what you're doing, but yeah, you sound very, very busy. And I'm just interested in the piece that you mentioned around the judo, actually, in terms of just some of the things that you looked at when you were growing up, and how that has influenced potentially how you are in the office, in the workplace today. How has your personal background influenced the type of leader that you are today, and how would you describe yourself as a leader?
Yeah, it influenced me in a lot of different ways, from both how I guess struggled in what was a minority sport in the country, and so not well resourced. It meant that often we were self-funding ourselves, a small group of athletes who were self-funding ourselves to try and get around the world, to all try and get to the Olympics, which was the obvious ultimate goal, and attending world championships. And I think that was useful for me, even in my day-to-day role, in terms of my interaction with the athletes or the footballers who represent our country. And because when often a lot of people think of professional football, associate them with the Premier League or La Liga or the top football leagues in the world, and they associate them with a lot of money. A lot of professional footballers are doing a lot of hard graft day in, day out. There's a lot of uncertainty, and not all of them are living the lives of Ronaldo every day. So I think just actually on that level of interaction and understanding that actually it's a real sacrifice, because when you go into a sole focus like that as well, you are effectively giving up a lot of opportunity. I mean, one of the outcomes of that was I came out at 30 with a very, there was no linear career progression because I had one sole focus, which was good to go to the Olympics, which I didn't achieve. Again, that built significant resilience out. I mean, it's a common cliche, but you learn a lot more from your failings, of course, than you do your successes. And actually, I've been able to give a lot of advice to athletes younger than me on what not to do, because I did so much wrong. So, I mean, that was good just from the martial arts perspective. I mean, judo as well is a sport that is about redirecting energy or attacks against you and diverting that energy elsewhere. I think so philosophically, especially in a role like mine where you have a lot of stakeholders who can be demanding, and you actually do, you're often in the line of fire around criticism. I think actually philosophically, it's enabled me to be calm, often under fire. A lot of people will say that, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm calm on the inside, but certainly on the exterior, I'm able to demonstrate a really calm exterior when a lot of others are panicking around me. And I think that gives, from a leadership perspective, although you might sometimes be thinking about things or perceiving things internally very differently, I think that those around you, when the situation is difficult, they look for somebody who is calm, somebody who looks like they're in control of the situation. And actually, this is an interesting balance here between being obviously perception and authenticity, because I think you also need to be honest to people around the situation, but actually people do look for those types of behaviors. So I actually think some of that has come through from judo, competing at a world championship where you've just lost and preparing for a really, really intense moment, so you get used to putting everything in perspective. So I think there's quite a few dimensions in which it's assisted me later on in life.
Amazing. You've touched upon the pros and some of the potential weaknesses, actually, just in terms of balancing lots of different things. And I think you're absolutely spot on that having a steady hand and being perceived to be calm, not just for those around you or the people who you're actually reporting to, but for people who are reporting into you, to see that you have got maybe control of something that is a little bit out of control. For me, I can definitely echo that's also been something that has featured a really big part of my career. And I've always been one to say things like, mindset is everything, but I truly, truly believe that. And it's been one of the major features in my career, which is also, I guess, why we have it as one of our four pillars at Fully Bossed. And I would just love to get your perspective on mindset in business. You've spoken a bit about the need to have determination and perseverance, and look at failure as potential opportunities. How do you define your own mindset in business, and how important do you think that is in business today?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's now, as I'm aging slowly, one thing that's become evident is how leadership is changing, and how some of the leadership styles that I probably used as a younger people manager, in particular 20 years ago, are less fit for purpose in this day and age. And I think that the piece that, within our organization, we have a workforce ranging from 20 years old through to 65. And I think in terms of mindset, I think the term that I use, or what I rely on the most, is being authentic and transparent to my entire workforce. So that has to be balanced, of course, between sometimes saying exactly what you really think, because things should always be framed, in a professional context. But I think that as long as I'm true to myself, and which is being, it's really simple things: being a good human, looking after people, keeping true to old adages like, at the end of the day, when you leave an organization, people will only remember how you treated them. It won't necessarily be about what the profit was, or a number of the other outcomes. And I think those small things that, think about when you're buried, what do you want to be known as? Those things come through really strong, I guess, hopefully in my behavior, and I hope the staff, I want the staff to know, your staff body have to know that you do truly care for them. And so keeping that at the center of my heart, keeping that at the center of all of my thinking is really important. I think in terms of, but that has to be balanced, I guess, that with that piece around demonstrating direction, demonstrating calm, even if there are some really challenging issues. So there is a balance to be struck. I think the risk in taking it to an extreme is that perhaps you lose the professional standards that need to be maintained in a good organization. So
You touched upon also legacy. It's a word that I don't think we probably speak about enough in business, actually, and it's certainly something that I think just as human beings we don't necessarily wake up and think about the legacy we want to leave when we're gone, because who really wants to think about that time? But it is important, and it somewhat does signal the direction in which you will take your career, or the type of leader that you want to be, I think, by thinking about that particular question. And it sounds like you've done some thinking about that. So would you let us in, and would you tell us what legacy you are looking to leave on the people that you work for and the people who work for you?
yeah, I mean, if you ask me to think about what I'd like to be remembered as, is the best boss. I think hopefully most leaders would like to say the best boss I ever had. I'm a big believer in that. If you get recruitment right, obviously recruitment is one of the most important decisions any leader or any manager ever makes. But if you get recruitment right and get people facing in the right direction, so everyone's clear on objectives, and then obviously there's check-in points that fundamentally empowering people and looking after people and showing that you care about people will get the results. I've encountered other leadership styles which are more around, I guess, perhaps a bit more of an authoritarian style, which is set a target or push the target higher, and people will have to perform. And I actually find that generally people want to perform, and when you demonstrate that you're interested in them as people, when you demonstrate that you actually care about them, then that's what brings out performance in people. And I think that I haven't always encountered that leadership style in a number of people, and I still see today people of a mindset that, look, if we just raise the bar, then the people will have to jump to that. I believe people can jump the bar, but they'll jump the bar at a certain level when they're given the direction and the encouragement. There's obviously a place for where you've got the wrong people in the wrong roles, where you've got people who aren't performing to take different types of action. But that's usually come about because of perhaps the structure's wrong, perhaps the wrong or the wrong people are in the wrong structure. So yeah, and I think sometimes people, look, I think there's a style that can work, provided the structure and people in place that gets better outcomes.
And a lot of what you've just mentioned, actually, one could hear some of your responses over the last couple of questions and think about the word resilience. And I know that when you had once spoken, when I was there, about resilience and what that means to you, it was probably a new twist on the word that I hadn't necessarily looked at or thought about before. And I would just love for you to elaborate on what resilience means to you in business. And if you can, I think you shared a story about your time in a boardroom, or just at the top, where you were actually just, I guess, reevaluating that word resilience based on what you were going through. So if you could just elaborate on what resilience means to you and why, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think I was raised under or in an era, and also through a sport where the old cliches of when the going gets tough, the tough get going, and grit your teeth and drive through it. And we all see these really strong motivational mantras online all the time about how it's tough, you just got to push on through. And look, some of that is very true. I do think there is a real place for knuckling down when things are hard, but equally that mantra can also be misinterpreted in certain instances. And actually, I heard this through COVID, and the definition of this form of resilience was not those who are so tough, if you like, that they can withstand pressure and intolerable pain or intolerable workloads, as it might be in the workplace. But actually, resilience is those who recognize when they're under intolerable loads and are able to either stop, put in a circuit breaker, and reach out for assistance. And I thought that was a really good definition, because I think in certain instances, actually, people do try and shoulder, that people with this mentality, they tend to rise up in roles, they climb careers. Unfortunately, if you don't have some kind of circuit breaker, everyone breaks at the end. And actually, quite a lot of people who we perceive to be successful in life, they have enormous support networks. They might have mentors. They often have mentors. Some of them have psychologists. Some of them, unfortunately, using medical interventions to get through what they're getting through. And I think just sometimes that classic mantra of, "Oh, look, we all just need to harden up and push on through, or do more, work harder," actually is a simple response to what is often a complex problem. I do think there's a place for a lot of people to knuckle down and do some work, and there is totally a place for that. But equally, people need to recognize that it's okay to reach out for help, that most people at some point in their life struggle. You look at the rates of anxiety, that's a global phenomena right now, and a lot of that is through people not reaching out and connecting. Obviously, there's a number of other things driving that, but I think recognizing when you're under pressure and stopping and saying, "Hey, this isn't okay." It's okay to say no to work. Simple things that people these days don't often accept, and it's okay to ask for help. I think the best leaders will ask for help, and actually the best leaders these days, and actually that garners respect, because young people read through anything in this day and age. If you can't show vulnerability, they'll understand that you are vulnerable, that you're hiding it. So you may as well be honest about it and front up, and actually they'll respect, especially in the younger workforce, they'll respect that, because that they are equally under a whole set of different pressures I'm finding with millennials. And actually it builds a common bond as well. I think shared vulnerability is one of the closest ways to form connection with other humans. And until you're vulnerable, people don't truly know who you are, because presenting an outward Superman or Superwoman, I mean, everyone knows that's false. We're all struggling in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of those struggles, I want to get maybe a little bit more personal about your specific journey. So can you think about and share with us a time that, I guess, your most memorable career challenge that you've had? Just give us a little bit of an insight into what that was and how you overcame that, whether it was you turned it into an opportunity or whether it was just you just survived the challenge, whatever it was. But if you just give us a sense of what that thing was, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Look, there's probably quite a few. The most memorable, I'll keep the very most memorable to myself, but I'll give you one that is more or relatively recent. Actually, winning the hosting rights to the Women's World Cup, which is obviously co-hosted between New Zealand and Australia, was very, very big task in terms of submitting a bid to FIFA that was successful and approved by their executive council. And in short, we faced a real enormous uphill battle convincing a lot of our stakeholders in New Zealand to be involved in the bid. And we were in quite a difficult situation, because we'd already agreed at that point in time to jointly co-host with Australia. And we needed to convince all of our cities in particular to sign hosting agreements with FIFA. And the FIFA agreements are quite one-sided insofar as they have a lot of, there's no negotiation on them, for starters. And because it's such a sought after event, they effectively have pretty strong rights over the cities. And we live in a country which is quite risk averse, if I'm honest, in terms of entering into that type of agreement. Cut a long story short, there was a 3-month period there where I thought we were not only going to not be able to submit a bid, but we were also going to sink Australia's hopes of bidding with us. And we'd already entered into some agreements that saw a joint bid and New Zealand-Australia relationship for some time, I think. This was actually this is an example of knuckling down. We had to develop a strategy and work through the night, really, it wasn't work through the night for 3 months, but certainly the last month there was limited sleep, and it was about trying to work with lawyers, but develop a strategy to city by city convince all of our country to come on board with the bid. And it was, I guess, that was straight resilience, really. I think by the end of the year, I was I mean, I was physically sick by the end of that year. So because of that combination of just sheer exhaustion, I find that what tends to happen physically when you work too much is your body can quite. I think your body, there's a connection. There's a subtle connection between the mind and body, and I find it happens every time around this year. Actually, when the workload's that high, is your body just keeps on pushing the mind to be able to work. And once it knows it's complete, it almost releases. And I quite often find once I've finished an enormously big bit of work, and this happened in this instance, is that everything shuts down. I mean, my theory behind that is the mind is telling the body that you can't get sick, that you have to keep working, because if you get sick, the work will not be able to be sustained. And whether that's true or not, I don't know. It's happened to me a number of times. What I often find, usually what tends to happen in New Zealand at this time of year, is we all work really hard. I mean, talking about the whole country, tends to work quite hard across October, November, December, because the country goes into a summer shutdown, if you like, over January. So everyone has these deadlines that have to be completed. And what I've personally found is my body sustains it, but almost in the days before Christmas, as the work is finished and everything is signed off, is I actually get sick. And I'm pretty sure that is a connection between the mind and body saying, you've done it, you can rest now. So, lesson for me now is to somehow plan around that and make sure that I manage that workload a bit better. Cut a long story short, we won the bid. Oh, we won the event.
Amazing. Well, congrats on that very recent thing, and look forward to hearing more about that all next year. I guess also just I guess somewhat linking to what you said, it would be really interesting to understand just a little bit more around misconceptions at your level. So big misconceptions that might exist at C-suite level. So it's not all roses. And I guess where you go to kind of get recentered. So you talked about some things that work for other people, whether it's psychologists or whether it's I don't know, speaking with friends or whatever the thing is. Who do you have in your squad team? I guess your core squad. Excuse the pun. To help you get recentered when you are going through these long nights or these various different challenges, whether it's physically or mentally. How do you make sure that you kind of stay grounded and stay true to what you're there to do, and I guess settle the calm? How do you do that? What tend to be your go-to things that you like to do?
Yeah, I think probably the one that I know works for me the best is physical exercise by far and away. And I think one thing that I know when I fall into a bad habit or trap is when I start to, if I allow the quantity of work to take over meaningful breaks, and then it begins to affect the quality. So for me, if I can get in an hour of like really intense and even more if possible physical exercise a day, that sets me up for that day. It means that I will likely, regardless of how many hours I work, be able to sleep well that night. If I get a good night's sleep. So exercise connects to, I mean, there's they're real basics, but exercise, sleep, and diet, real basic foundation blocks. But people get them wrong, and I still get them. I know that I need those things, and I still get them wrong regularly because it's so easy to go, I don't have time for a run or the gym. I'll do another hour's work. But you don't realize that in doing that extra hour's work, you've compromised the quality of the next 8 hours. It's easy to slip in to get a quick meal or a takeaway meal, and you don't realize that in doing that, so you've compromised the quality of your behavior and how you feel for the next number of hours. So fundamental basic blocks of exercise, sleep, and diet. I mean, everyone knows it, but everyone still falls into the same trap. And then I think family and friends, obviously, that one of the biggest challenges in this day and age, especially with social media, is people talk about it all the time, mindfulness. So putting yourself, little things that surround yourself with family and friends, getting rid of your phone when and where you can. I mean, I do. Some people think this is outrageous, but I turn my emails off when I go on holiday on my phone. And people say, look, and raising your threshold for what you think an emergency is. So people know how to call me if there's an emergency, and they'll call me if there's a really big deal. But I increasingly have to remind my staff that if you're on leave, you shouldn't be answering your emails. Turn it off. And I think there's this thing now where phones have been one of the greatest inventions, but one of the greatest kind of catches of for modern society, whereby people feel they need to be on call and answering regularly, and pushing back really hard on those things, and creating some firm rules for yourself in that space is really important. Raising the threshold even mentally for what is a real dire emergency. I say, look, if someone's died, I want to know about it. If someone's but it's a really high threshold. Otherwise, deal with it. Too often people get into creating a sense of emergency, but if everyone's got their health and the organization's not about to go under, we're okay. So coming back to basic mental building blocks around what a real problem is, and not escalating problems. I mean, I have used at times mentors. I think it's really good. Everyone should have a colleague. If you don't have it, obviously being a CEO, you don't have a peer necessarily, and you're reporting into a board, and you've got large groups of staff under you. So I certainly use external mentors or people to vent to over a drink, or So I have quite a few. Or two. Yeah, absolutely. So trust and confidence are really important as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's really refreshing to hear you speak like that. It took me back when you said that you encourage your teams to switch off. It took me back to a moment where I remember a client of mine in a very in a bank, well-known bank, saying that he expected his entire banking staff, banking kind of C-suite team to be switched on. And I think that's just a normal recursion that some people hear in certain industries. So it's great that you have completely a different outlook on that. I just want to touch on two more things, and then we can, I think, probably draw it to a close. But one is around rebranding, and I wonder, as a CEO who has obviously made it to this great position in this large, great organization, you've talked about the fact that you've worked for, I think you said, maybe a couple of decades, and you've obviously seen when you started out working, obviously things have changed. How do you try to stay current as an impactful leader? Because I think everything that you've spoken about points towards you wanting to have purpose, and you clearly having purpose and being an impactful type of leader. But clearly you are also serving different audiences in terms of your teams. You're working with different colleagues who have and different peers who maybe also are going through this level of change, and they're seeing the world is a different place to how it started. So I guess some of our viewers might be listening thinking, oh my God, you're the CEO, like everything's, you must be perfect. But I guess, how do you almost ensure that you are staying relevant to the people who you are serving, whether they are your clients, your investors, your teams? How do you constantly think about the need to be relevant and current, and therefore rebrand your own leadership style?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm fortunate insofar as, I've got quite a young workforce in my organization. And so they teach me. I guess I watch them a bit like an anthropologist might, and study, but an interested one who's interested in the way they interact, the things that they value. And obviously there's that side of it. I think I do read quite a lot, I guess, around leadership styles, and think about, and there's so much, I mean, this is again a little cliche, but there's so much disruption in the world today. I think classic word, and I hate to use it, but you do need to stay agile in terms of things. Things change so quickly now that it's almost a mindset. You need to have a mindset which is prepared to change anything and everything. Little example for us, we're looking at e-football, so online forms of football, as in FIFA 21, as a form of our game. The reality is, probably in 20 years, people will play as much, if not more, virtual football as they will. So thinking about the obviously the bigger mega trends that are happening around the globe, and how they will impact on your industry. And sometimes there won't be research in that space. So you have to look at the mega trends that are happening in other industries, mentally be a forward thinker, and supplant some of those ideas into your industry, and talk with industry leaders. Obviously, I attend conferences, and key to remember as a leader is you're always far from the finished product. If you're not continuously learning, you're probably going to be displaced. You're probably going to be displaced anyway, so it doesn't matter. I think my father-in-law said to me that the first thing the CEO does from day one is begin managing their exit, which I thought was quite a interesting way to look at it. But to a certain extent, that does happen in a lot of industries. So don't hold on to your. I don't cling fiercely to my role in a protective way. I think a really good leader will see themselves as a baton carrier, if you like, who is in a race, and you have to be prepared to pass that baton whenever the time comes. They are precarious roles, regardless of. I think in any kind of industry or sector, because the CEO is the pointy end of responsibility and accountability, they are roles that you need to be prepared to pack your bags and go tomorrow. So keep a mindset that you're going to keep learning during that period, and if you do have to go tomorrow, that you'll be ready to pass the baton to the next person. And the great thing is, young people who are coming through, because we're trying to drive a lot of change in football. We're trying to, in this country, we're trying to change the way, or it's trying to change the demographics of our sport. We're trying to change the types of leaders and bring through new forms of leadership. But I'm quite encouraged. There's so much doom and gloom in the world around climate, a lot of the tension. But actually, when you see young people, some of the progressive styles of thinking and some of their behaviours are really encouraging. I have quite an optimistic, perhaps with the exception of the climate change. But outside of that, I have quite an optimistic view on the world and some of the young people coming through, and who will overtake me quite quickly as leaders, I think.
Amazing, great stuff.
Mm.
And in terms of, I guess, just moving it onto some soft skills, which you've talked about throughout this interview. But if you could think of 3 soft skills that have really helped you progress to where you have gotten to, and I'm not just talking about the progression to becoming a CEO, but everything you've also talked about in terms of being a calm leader, an impactful leader. If you can just think about the 3 top soft skills that have helped you in your career, that'd be great. And then just in terms of reflection, what would be your advice in terms of soft skills that people starting out in their careers, and also people, I guess, middle range of their careers, should really be focusing on in this day and age?
Yeah, sure. I think the number one skill that is the most important to me is the lost art of listening. So you would think that most people, that listening is something we all have. I think a lot of people are often set to transmit rather than receive. They're often thinking, "What's the next thing I'm going to say?" And actually, listening deeply is different from just hearing. Like really listening, seeking to understand, and therefore listening doesn't usually end with "oh, and here's my response to what you just said." Listening usually should end with another question, because usually people don't explain themselves in full in a couple of sentences. So I think most people, no, that's perhaps unfair. A lot of people don't listen. A lot of people come into an interaction wanting to transmit their ideas first. And if you can listen and then listen again and then listen more deeply and then really seek to understand and relay what you heard back to somebody, first thing you'll do there is form a connection. And if you form a connection, then they may be ready to receive you. So often we see interactions where everyone's on transmit, but there's no receiving. And yeah, you see that in professional meetings, you see that in day-to-day personal interaction. So listening is the basis. For me, that's the foundational skill that's required. I think off the back of that, obviously the communication and communication style is really key. Being able to adapt and particularly verbally communicate well and a clear, concise message is important, but suitable to the audience, and making sure you change that for the audience that you're seated in or that you're around. I think, and in that communication style, speaking from the heart. I never now go into speeches I don't speak from notes or speeches. I think about, I usually go into a setting and go really deeply around what emotion that setting conjures in me, draw heavily on that emotion, and then think quickly, try and transgress from that emotion to the 1, 2, or 3 key things that I really want to get across to whatever that audience might be. And while I speak, draw on that emotion, and usually it comes through. People can see it or they can feel it as much as they can hear it. So I think communication is probably I mean, communication is a big term for a lot of different soft skills, but those are the big ones. I think there's probably the last one, ability to facilitate interactions between groups as well, I think. And sometimes that's a little bit of the two previous skills of listening and communicating. But when there's conflict between groups, if you're able to, sometimes if neither of them can listen or speak to each other, if you're actually able to hear both parties, and effectively mediate results, that's incredible, to be able to resolve others' problems for them, and hopefully everyone learns through the process. So those would be the soft skills. First of all, know that everyone is a leader. One of the challenges is that sometimes people perceive that leadership's hierarchical in terms of you need to be up a higher. And so think about, first and foremost, before you even, well, certainly the skills need to come at the same time, but think really importantly about who you are as a person, what you value, and therefore how you want to lead. I think it's worth reading about. There's so many different ways to lead. I think it's about knowing who you are and having the self-awareness to know who you are. That there's some great stuff written about introverts as leaders, and I think too often we see these stereotypical types of leadership. I know I'm going off topic a little bit here, but I'll come back to the soft skills. But I think first and foremost, knowing what leadership style will work for your own identity and who you are as a person is useful, and knowing that doesn't need to be upper hierarchy either. It could be in lots of different shapes and forms, and also knowing that regardless of who you are, that may be upper hierarchy as well. You don't need to be an extrovert, or you don't need to be the loudest, or you don't necessarily need to be the smartest person in the room. You don't need to speak first. And I think if you do want to progress though into an area of leadership that's going to be involving working with people, it is going to have to involve a lot of understanding and therefore a lot of listening. I'd prioritize that, because sometimes the people who are the most impactful are the ones also who speak the least. I remember early on in one of my management roles, I went to a large meeting of a big organization that was due to make a decision. And I didn't actually know who was really in the room. Wasn't clear to me. There were lots of people from lots of different departments. Everyone went around the table, and the meeting was begun by somebody else. It wasn't clear to me what was going on. Everyone said their opinion on this particular issue, and at the end, a guy spoke and said, "Okay, I've heard all of these things. We're going to do this." And I turned around and I realized he was by far and away the most senior manager in the room, who actually had the decision-making authority, but he'd spoken the least in the discussion. His part was to listen to everyone and make the most informed decision. He spoke really well, and it closed the meeting. He spoke the least in the room, but it was also the most impactful statement and the most informed. So I think I'd prioritize listening. I'd prioritize simple aspect of getting to know and understand people and form connections before to build trust. Building trust is critical in any working relationship, and if you don't have trust, it's really hard. High trust leads to high speed too. If we're in distrustful settings, or particularly I'm talking about in organizations, as opposed to maybe negotiating deals, but building high trust is key. And so figuring out which skills you have that can build high trust really quickly are key. So for me, that's vulnerability and being really honest up front around my challenges, and that quickly disarms people. They do the same, and next thing you're on the same team. So yeah, I think those would be some real foundation building blocks for me.
Fantastic, thank you. And look, I'm going to build on what you've said also, but also I'm going to confess that I did say that I only had probably one more question, but I think I've added two more based on what you've said. So I'm pushing my other question, but my next question to you will be around DE and I. You're obviously doing a lot in that respect with hosting the Women's World Cup next year. You talked a lot about listening and understanding and people and communication, all things which are superly important when I think about the inclusion piece of DE and I, seeking to understand people, seeking to understand their experiences, and showing representation for different people and different people's experiences. So I'm just curious to understand your views on DEI, depending on the industry also. We may have heard a lot more about DEI from more so the Western world, so more so Europe, and of course Americas, with everything that's happened over the last few years. As a person who has actually just moved recently to Asia, I know that we talk a lot about DEI from a gender perspective.
Mm.
So just with the listening aspect, I'm just asking you as a CEO, your views on DEI and the importance of that inclusion piece, not just from a gender perspective, but for all elements of the workforce. I'd love to just get your thoughts on the importance of inclusive leadership.
Yeah, 100%. So I think, I mean, first and foremost, the research and evidence is out there and really strong that a more diverse workforce leads to better outcomes. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Diversity of background typically leads to diversity of experience, typically leads to diversity of thought, and diversity of thought is the foundation of generally of better outcomes. So I think the evidence base for those I guess naysayers or the ones who are dragging the chain need to take a closer look at the research, regardless of whether it's the right thing to do or not. But from purely productivity and getting the best outcomes, there's an incredibly strong case that our workforces and our organisations and what they strive to do should represent the communities in which we live. And obviously, there are a lot of industries that are still lagging in that respect. So there's a strong case for it, regardless. From my perspective, one of the objectives we've set for football in New Zealand is to represent the communities in which we live, and that's with regards to everything, gender, ethnicity, disability, and all different backgrounds. So that is a bit of a challenge for us because we only control parts of the system. So, and we need to influence people, I guess. It's really interesting. One of the things that's happened as a result, there's been a real strong focus on, because of the current government in New Zealand, on a more equitable approach to gender generally in sport. And we've got some really strong leadership from the government that's actually driven a quota in place to ensure that all national sporting bodies have no less than 40% female representation on their boards. The quota argument's a really interesting one, but actually, as the leadership pointed out at the time, look, we've been asking for more female representation on boards for about 30 years, and it wasn't happening. And actually, since this has been put in place, it's almost been universally achieved, which is fantastic. So I think, and I know there's a lot of debates back and forth over the use of quotas. We actually applied something similar to our regional entities below us who deliver football, and they've quickly jumped on board. There's a real willingness to. I think people just need to. There's resistance in certain quarters, but people need a bit of encouragement. But so there has been a real focus from our side, first and foremost, on gender. But actually, football in particular, we're lucky insofar as it's a sport that appeals to so many people. The rules are simple, regardless of whether you experience a disability, whatever your background is, there are ways in which you can participate in football. And the same can't be said of every sport. So we're really unique in some respects. So we're trying to harness that. We are trying to look at ways in which there's a lot of people who play what we call unaffiliated football in New Zealand. So they're not playing in a traditional club. It might be in a church league, it might be in an ethnic league, it might be in another form. We're looking at ways in which we can change our membership model, because ultimately we feel if we're connected to them and they're connected to us, there'll be a value exchange, not necessarily monetary, but really positive, because basically we all love football. It's a big strategic goal for the organisation. I think, from my perspective, acknowledging and knowing that we all have biases is something that we all have to continually confront. So, always checking yourself at the door when you're listening, that you're hearing it from their perspective. Always making sure that you go, okay, so why, even challenging your own thought. Well, I think that because, always think back to your own background, and therefore, why has that produced a certain thought pattern? And it also helps to explain in others. And I think, we do a lot of subconscious bias training. With the workforce has gone through that. Everyone has a bias. It might be unconscious to you, and so not understanding that actually helps you to understand yourself.
Yeah.
And it helps you to understand your decision making. So that's been a big part, I think, of making sure my workforce is educated in that as well, and making sure that they are aware of their biases. and that we respectfully challenge some of those biases when appropriate too.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for those views, especially coming from a football association. Really always interesting to get the kind of the perspectives outside of, as I say, gender, but just more broadly on experiences that all of those different people that you're interacting with face, and how you guys are incorporating that into your daily life. So thank you for giving those views. My last question to you, conscious of time, you talked about your legacy earlier, and you also talked about the direction of, you know, where you would go next potentially as a CEO. And I loved what your father-in-law had said to you in terms of always planning for your next role, which I think as a CEO, which I think is pretty apt, particularly for me coming from financial services. So my question to you would be, what's next for you in the context of that legacy? You talked about wanting to be known as being a great boss, an impactful boss, if I can say, an impactful leader, if I could say. So beyond this role, what would be next?
Oh, great question. Well, next year we've got the Women's World Cup to host, and so if for someone who is thinking about the world in 2050, it's kind of sad that I haven't thought personally beyond the Women's World Cup. And probably, if anything, I'm guilty of not making any personal plans too far beyond that. I think if I think deep down, I've got two teenage daughters who are 13 and 14, and it's important that I'm present for them. And by present, I mean I'm often physically present, but not always mentally present. So
Right.
I think actually for me, the most important thing is not necessarily a career progression, but a balanced progression as a person. So I'm still on that journey and trying to, as I alluded to, strike that right balance. And so I'll be comfortable in any role so long as my well-being and overall balance is struck. It's a bit of an escape answer, so I'll give you a bit more detail. I think I'd love to stay in sport and entertainment. I love fun. I want, if I were to move a role, I want it to be impactful and something that drives a lot of passion in people. Yeah, I'd love something that, I guess, stirs the heart, if you like.
That was a perfect answer, by the way. That was a perfect answer. I think when I've had that question before in terms of where do I see myself in 5 years, or what do I want next, I loved what you said about the emotion and the feeling, because for me it's a feeling. It's not a title, it's not a role. For me it's how I want to feel, and
Yes.
that's largely working towards some, like, my purpose that I set for myself. So I also love the fact that you spoke about your two daughters. Lovely, two teenage daughters, because if you recall, I've got two baby daughters. So yeah, I can imagine I will probably, if I'm lucky enough to see them as teenagers, God willing, I'll also be having the same reflections that you'll be having at this point in my career. So thank you so much for being open with us and sharing a few stories and sharing some advice for our listeners. I think that was really insightful.